Right, I think we'll begin. Welcome everyone to this event on adaptation and climate change called Feeling the Heat. My name is McCarron. I am the International Programme Manager here at the Conservative Environment Network. It is now day 3 of conference, so if you cannot hear me, that is because I have succumbed to the conference cold. If at any point you can't hear me, wave of a back and I will speak up. We are the Conservative Environment Network. If you don't know anything about us, first of all, you have been missing out on a packed conference schedule. But second of all, we are the independent forum for the Conservatives in the UK and around the world who support net zero nature restoration and resource security. We have supporters and a councillors network, so do sign up for that. Now we have a fantastic panel lined up for you today. So, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to introduce themselves and open with some opening remarks on this for a quick 3 minutes, then I'm going to ask a question. Then it's over to you guys. So, I'm going to start with our MP, Theo Clarke, who is a member of the International Development Select Committee and also a proud member of the SEN Parliamentary Caucus.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. I wanted to really focus in my remarks about climate change being a global issue which needs global cooperation and talk a bit about where the UK overseas aid budget is working to tackle this issue. As Finn mentioned, I sit on the IDC, but I also chair our subcommittee on the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, so that's reviewing where our overseas development budget is being spent. And I've also recently just commissioned a report looking at climate change and agriculture, looking at where ODA is being spent and really how we're sort of adapting in countries around the world facing very extreme weather conditions, such as, for example, Kenya and drought. And I'll give some examples in Africa a bit later. But let me start off by saying I'm going to talk traditionally today about international examples. But of course, in my own constituency in Stafford, which is just 90 minutes down the road, we are obviously also experiencing the same issues, whether it's increased high temperatures and flooding. For example, the River Stour has burst its banks, and obviously in the summer we've had extremely high temperatures which have been setting new records across England. So let me start by saying sort of where are we now internationally with the picture? I think it's a good moment to sort of reflect as we're halfway through the SDGs, which we're trying to deliver to end extreme poverty by 2030. And of course, SDG 13 is focused on climate action. And first, I really welcome that the government has been so committed to the SDGs agenda. We have committed to targets on strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity, specifically focused on climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. And we've also committed to work within the United Nations framework on climate change. And I'm particularly interested in how we leverage capital to be working on these issues. And we have made a commitment to work within the UN system to mobilise $100 billion annually to work on integrating climate change measures into national policies. So obviously, a lot of our global leaders have just got back within the last few weeks from a couple of major summits. The first was the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and I myself was in Paris for the recent summit with Macron. And first, I do really welcome that global leaders have recommitted to climate change as being one of the greatest challenges of our time. And what I really wanted to talk about today was about the mitigation and the adaptation of climate change. And I do think it is a present and immediate threat, especially in the countries that I spend a great deal of time in, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. This is not a problem in 10, 50 years' time. This is something affecting farmers today in Kenya who are not able to farm and to grow food. So firstly, we need to recognise that we've got to stay within the 1.5 limits of the Paris Climate Agreement, and we need to ensure that the G20 countries, not just the UK, but around the world, are taking steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that 80% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from G20 countries, so we've got to break their addiction to fossil fuels. My role is as the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Kenya, and maybe in the questions later I can give you some examples of some of the green investments and the deals that I've just signed on behalf of the British government last week, where we're really trying to show that commitment in renewables and to move away from fossil fuels. Obviously, the UK has recently made some changes to our net zero policy, but I do believe that the UK is committed to supporting climate action in developing countries. The Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, gave a major speech earlier in the year at Chatham House, and he talked about how we need to transform international finance to mobilise the trillions of dollars that are going to be needed to deliver on our problems of climate change. Just to remind ourselves of the context that we're working in today. For example, today in Niger, the loss of arable land is close to about 500 football pitches a day that we're losing, which can no longer be farmed. So in terms of food security, this is a major and growing problem. We're already spending about $1 billion on humanitarian relief, so we've got to ensure that our UK aid programming has built into it future resilience to climate change impacts, and also that we're meeting our international climate change adaptations. And there's a couple of ways that the UK government's doing that through different vehicles. I obviously work in the Department for Business and Trade for Kenry Baynock, and UKF is a very good example of that. It's really the first export credit agency to offer things like a climate resilience debt clause, and that's really quite an innovative finance solution that other countries haven't brought in. So we need to be working with these countries to make sure that they're getting access to private sector finance, and we're making sure that things like insurance support for places like Somalia with drought are being introduced, because they don't really have these insurance market systems at all. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the UK's approach to climate action in developing countries. I mentioned about the debt repayments and freeing up disaster response and recovery. We've also set up things like a $2 billion direct lending facility to financing clean growth projects. And obviously, just in September, the Kenyan government hosted a major summit on Africa and climate. And Andrew Mitchell did attend that conference and announced that £49 million of the UK's budget will now be focused on climate finance and resilience. So I think there's a lot of work the British government is doing. I think there's a lot more still to be done. I think when we're sat here in Manchester in our nice convention centre with air conditioning and running lights, I think we forget what it's like in a large number of these developing countries. They're responding to disasters, whether it's hurricanes, floods, and then the mitigations of climate change are going to be increasing. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think the UK cannot do it alone. Global problems require global solutions, and I'm pleased that the UK is taking an international lead on this, but we need all countries to step up and do the same.
Thank you very much, Theo. And now, if you saw the advertised programme, you would have seen that Beck Smith was meant to speak. Unfortunately, Beck Smith has succumbed to a zoonotic disease, which may have been exacerbated by climate change, and therefore cannot speak. So instead, we have wonderful Artie Hartwell, instead, from the Wellcome Trust, who very kindly is sponsoring this panel. And she is the Climate and Health Policy Lead.
Thank you, and thank you again to Sen as well for co-hosting this event. It's really good to be here today. I too succumbed to the Unger COVID bug, as we keep calling it now, but luckily testing negative, and just have a bit of a COVID haze at the moment. So, but delighted to be here today. So thank you to Theo, Clarke as well. It was actually just really great to hear that intervention and also hear just about how much the UK government is doing and prioritising climate action. As Finn mentioned, I'm from the Wellcome Trust, and at the Wellcome Trust we are committed to spending $16 billion over the next 10 years looking at some of the greatest global health challenges, one of which is climate and health. And the reason for doing so is the WHO has also declared climate change as being the greatest threat to global health. And as we currently sitting here today, existing climate change, and that's projected for the future, is substantially altering the current development. So trying to reach goals like the SDGs really need to put climate change and climate action right at the foreground. But where we want to look at this is the health equity argument. We want to foreground climate justice. We want to foreground public health and protecting population health as the driver to help accelerate climate action, and that's both in mitigation and adaptation strategies as well. Because we believe that by putting health at the heart of climate action, you will reap the benefits in terms of health outcomes as well. So we want to try and transform the generation of where we're actually getting this evidence, and we need to bring that evidence to policymakers to start looking at activities that can really be scaled up as well. And finally, I'll just say with good climate policy and good health policy, they actually both go hand in hand. So when we're looking at adaptation strategies, for example, health can be a really good way to look at the suitability of these measures across all sectors. So when we think of a healthy population, we think of one that has access to adequate services, food, health and sanitation, housing. So what we want to try and do and promote is that climate policy should be appraised for the health outcomes and the benefits, because we feel that protecting public health is the utmost importance.
Thank you very much. And I'll stick with this side of the room to go on to Zoe Knowles, who is a fellow at Create Streets and the former special advisor to the Ontario Health Minister in Canada.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with such an esteemed panel. I'm very honored and humbled. So hello everybody, my name is Zoe Knowles. I am a fellow with Create Streets. I am also an account director with a public affairs firm called Trafalgar Strategy. And as Finn mentioned, I come from a Canadian government background. During the pandemic, I was the senior SPAD to Ontario's health minister, and thereafter the senior SPAD to Ontario's housing minister. As Arthi had mentioned, climate change is the number one single greatest long-term risk to our health. It significantly affects our health in a number of ways, ranging from how climate change exacerbates flooding, which brings vector-borne illnesses, other waterborne parasites, and of course flooding also brings with it injury and risk of death. As well, flooding also leads to about 33% higher risk of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Climate change also brings with it more extreme heat situations. This is especially true for urban environments, which are typically 5 degrees Celsius warmer than non-cities. Indeed, for every 1 degree increase above 20 degrees Celsius, NHS ambulance callouts increase by 1%. Climate change also brings with it increased severity and frequency of allergens. Nobody likes hay fever, especially not when it lasts for 2 entire seasons. And finally, of course, air pollution. Greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions significantly undermine the quality of our air, leading to increased severity and risk of respiratory illnesses. But we can fix this. If we build a more sustainable environment, we build a healthier environment. That means building more green and active infrastructure. That means building more homes more densely and more sustainably. And that means building up our health system by investing in community-based preventative care, by integrating our public health authorities with our institutional acute care centers and primary care in health hubs. And that also means developing health climate action plans. England's heat wave plan has been very successful so far. We've seen similar successes around the world. And that's really, really important to set very clear targets, very clear responsibilities for who is responsible to do what are the alert temperatures that we really need to be mindful of. But all this needs to happen right now. So as I mentioned, I'm from Canada, which is really providing a window into the future of what climate change does to a population en masse. Right now, across my home country, Canadians in Atlantic Canada are being forced out of their homes due to floods. Canadians across the Rockies and the prairies are being forced out of their homes due to fires. This is also especially striking given that 4 out of the past 5 years in Canada have broken the preceding year's record for the amount of land that is covered by forest fires. That means we need to not only mitigate and significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but we really need to adapt our communities to be prepared for the significant effects that climate change has on our infrastructure and on our health. It really gives new meaning to the phrase being under the weather, but it's not all doom and gloom. We can fix it, but we need to address this right now. Thank you.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Ryan Henson, who is the CEO of Coalition for Global Prosperity. Ryan.
Well, thank you, Finn, and it's a pleasure to be on a SEN platform. I think SEN do such brilliant work, so it's a real privilege to be here. The first thing I'd say is, from an international perspective, climate change is a real threat multiplier. It exacerbates the effects of existing vulnerabilities, such as population growth, poverty, rapid urbanisation, and can limit sustainable development as well. It will further reduce access to drinking water, decrease crop yields, threaten food security, and contribute to poor health. And according to the World Bank, up to 132 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty due to climate change by 2030. Climate change could wipe out 15% of Africa's GDP by 2030, resulting in an additional 100 million people pushed into extreme poverty by the end of the decade. But the frustrating thing for everyone is the continent only produces 2 to 3% of global emissions. And if you look at Asia and the example of Pakistan, Pakistan produces just 1% of emissions, yet is among the top 8 countries affected by climate change. And last year during the floods, a third of that country was underwater. 33 million people were affected. These are stats that just are almost impossible to imagine. Earlier this year, I was in northern Kenya in a place called Marsabit, and I met with rural communities who have had their livestock wiped out. I don't mean damaged, I don't mean a few died. As we drove into the village, we saw carcasses of what was the livelihood of people who lived there for generations and generations and generations. And I spoke to some farmers who are about my age, and some of them were contemplating suicide because they saw absolutely no hope. And I spoke to women who normally in these situations would not have come and spoke to someone like me, and they said their biggest fear was the men following through on their threat or running away, and how would they cope. And it really just brings it home to you, the scale of this issue. I mean, how are countries overseas adapting? Well, I think some are diversifying their crops, for example, planting mangroves as natural sea defences. We know that militaries across the world are adapting accordingly so that they can fight in extreme heat. But those people that I met in Marsabit, they can't adapt. They're screwed, basically. So that's why this is so important, and I think it's so right that we're here at Conservative Party Conference discussing it.
Thank you all. So I'm going to use Chair's privilege to ask the first question, but I think a couple of you already touched on it in your opening statements, and it's, what are the health effects of climate change, and how far are we adapting to them? What do we think is the most important health effect to be talking about? Does anyone want to come in on that first, particularly, before I pick on someone?
I'm happy to
Sure.
And, well, the speaker from the Wellcome Trust mentioned about vector-borne diseases, something that I've seen myself on various trips on behalf of the International Development Select Committee is particularly the impact of diseases in flooding areas. For example, I went to Bangladesh to visit the Rohingya camp, and it was just after extremely heavy rainfall where people are basically not even able to sleep in tents. They're literally sleeping sort of makeshift poles, trying to lift them up out of the floodwater. And the thing I immediately noticed arriving in the camp was just the swarms of mosquitoes everywhere. Where you have stagnant water and pools collecting, that's where malaria starts to breed. And I think the thing I found the most shocking about that is that if you look at all the places where this is happening, so I'm thinking particularly last year, Pakistan obviously had the most extreme flooding that they've had. Pakistan had done an amazing job of actually reducing malaria in a number of provinces, and they were really tracking and trying to reduce it. And then literally overnight, you had a third of the country underwater, and as I've just described, where the mosquitoes start replicating, malaria went up by fourfold in Pakistan as a result of those floods. And that's something that really struck me, is that those are now villages and communities which are basically completely cut off and unreachable. It's inaccessible when there's high water, but also you're now getting vector-borne diseases and they're not able to be treated because they just don't have access to health. So I think a lot of people say to me, what is the link between climate change and health? Why have we been talking about the two in the same sentence? But that is exactly the example, right, where you have flooding and then you have increase of malaria-borne diseases, and then actually a public health emergency where we were resolving the problem and now it's becoming worse.
Did you guys want to?
So I would add to that on flooding, 1.8 million Brits live in areas that are at significant risk of flooding. That's going to dramatically increase, number one, the cost to our health system to support those people as they get sick and injured. It's also immensely costly to our infrastructure. But setting aside flooding just for a moment, I think it's also very important to emphasize the effects of heat in this country. We're not very accustomed to being a very hot country, and I think that actually gives us, puts us in a very dangerous position, because as the UK gets hotter every year, well, in particular in certain cities like London and in southeast England, the people at risk of heat-related mortality is increasing dramatically. Between 2004 and 2018, heat-related mortality in people aged 65 plus increased by 21%. That has significant costs on our health system, but the effects that heat has on cardiovascular health is one of the prime target areas for public health preventative interventions, not only through a heat wave plan that clearly articulates, this is how you educate healthcare workers and public health workers on, detecting the signs for an oncoming heat wave. These are, PSAs to people to say, we're anticipating a very hot season. Make sure you wear, loose-fitting clothing. Make sure you drink water. It's one of those areas where public health intervention can be extremely effective. To use an example from my birth city, Montreal. Montreal had implemented a heat wave emergency program a couple of years ago, and they have seen the daily heat-related mortalities decrease fivefold. Just by educating people, it's going to be really hot. These are the ways that you can be affected by this. But it's also very important to keep in mind that not only through public health intervention, but also through having more airtight homes and homes that are better insulated. That's another way that we can really mitigate mitigate the effects of heat on our health and really adapt our society. It's something that can be done, but it's something that I think is we as a country, because we're not accustomed to that level of heat, it can really come as a surprise.
I think the only thing I would add to heat wave plans, and really excited to see UK HSE together with the Met Office plan for issuing heat advisories, is just what you can do with that. So with that information about alerting vulnerable communities or at-risk communities, having outreach programs specifically for the most vulnerable, and by the most vulnerable we're also talking about children within schooling environments as well here in the UK, but also the elderly as well, and also thinking through examples of cooling centres, for example, where you can get people out from their homes and to a centre where they can get some relief as well. And just finally on the vector-borne disease as well, again just thinking of the UK context, where we might not see dengue fever or malaria here, not ruling it out, but we're not seeing it. What we might see is different patterns in ticks and where they move. So we're talking about Lyme disease here and seeing movement across that respect as well.
And Ryan, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, the health impacts that I saw in Masterpit, there's probably four. First of all is mental health. I mean, how do you cope psychologically if your livelihood has been wiped out and you think your family might follow? And these are not people with access to therapists. Even then, it would be pretty tough. The other point is around conflict. I don't think it's a coincidence that Al-Shabaab and other terror groups like that thrive in areas where hope is beginning to feel non-existent. Third is competition for resources, which increases the risk of violence. We know that climate change exacerbates those sorts of competitions. And fourth, most topical for us in the UK, I think if people feel they have no chance left where they are, they're going to go elsewhere. And we've seen that play out on the news with asylum seekers. I mean, you have to be pretty desperate to hand over everything you have left to people smugglers and take that awful journey. But that's obviously the biggest health risk that I can see.
Thank you very much. Now, I think we should have a SEN team member on a roving mic, so if anyone has any questions from the audience... Yep, I think there's 2 down that side, which would be quite easy. I'm going to take them in batches of 3, basically. Yeah.
Hi, Emma from WWT Wildfire Wetlands Trust. My question was just on natural flood management. We work a lot on projects creating wetlands for flood resilience, and we know that not only enables us to adapt to the impacts of climate change, but also brings multiple benefits, including health and well-being, in terms of access to nature, water quality, improving water quality, and also carbon storage. It was great to see the government invest an extra 25 million recently in NFM schemes, but we still need a massive amount of funding to really deliver that at scale if we hope to kind of adapt to climate change and really address the problem. Sorry, this is a bit of a long question now. And that funding not only needs to be for projects, but also for providing guidance and engagement officers on the ground to ensure there are expertise in local authorities, etc. So my question was just around what government plans to do to address that gap. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, next.
Thank you. Mike Leonard from Building Alliance and Birmingham City University. We've done a lot of work into overheating as a PhD research into that. So my concern is that, question really is, are we designing to build now for the future needs, given that we're going to miss our climate change target, we're going to have these severe weather events, we're going to have long periods of overheating, 40 degrees plus. Are our homes going to be fit for purpose, given that we seem to be still promoting lightweight construction a lot, and that construction will overheat, will provide conditions where wildfires can take hold, as we saw in Canada, and the smoke and everything else. So my question really to the panel is this time now to start thinking about the long term rather than the short term?
Okay, great. And I think there was another hand there at the back, so you don't have to go too far.
Thank you. I'm Chairman, Co-Councillor from Slough. Yes, the effects of the climate change are very obvious, well known, and all the, the damages it's done to the health, to environment, to economics and all. But there are still some doubters who say it's a natural phenomena, while science is on the other side. So, but my question is, now, money is being poured into preventing the climate change. What can be done on individual basis, on local basis, on a national basis, on level, national level, and international, so that it has the most effective, most desired effect on the climate change. So anyway, so mostly I think it is carbon dioxide we're talking about when we are talking about the greenhouse gases. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got 3 very large questions there. Stuff about natural flood resistance and probably also generally nature-based solutions. Are we building for the future? And then possibly the biggest question we could ask in this room is, how do we solve climate change? But let's also talk about how we adapt to climate change. Theo, do you want to come in on any of these?
Yeah, I just want to pick up the one about flooding, because I'm doing a big campaign on flooding in my constituency. 2 things on that. Firstly, I think the government has invested a lot of money into flooding. My constituency in the Midlands has been picked as part of a new product with DEFRA, where we're getting additional funding for flood forecasting and a sort of natural flood management scheme. So that's really going to be using data better, using things like CCTV footage, data mapping, so we can work out where the floods are occurring and work better with local communities to let them know what's happening. So I should say, firstly, there is additional funding going into this. But I also think we need to look at all the different stakeholders when we're talking about flooding. So if I look in the centre of town in Stafford, we've had unprecedented flooding, the worst in 100 years since I've been the MP, where the whole high street was literally had running water down, going into shops, going to my hotels, causing hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of damage. We have basically Stafford built on the middle of a traditional bog that was there 1,000 years ago. About the worst place to build a town if I was doing town planning now. But what we've been doing is trying to work with our local farming community and trying to work with the farmers to say what can we do to mitigate flooding, and also working with groups like the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust to say how can we build things like pocket parks. So that's a new project that I was very supportive of, where we've worked with our local wildlife trust, and we've had sort of small patches of environmental land where we've basically designated it to be a pocket park. So it really, in effect, becomes like sort of sponge, and it will collect all of the rainwater and stop it going into the centre of my high street and start spreading the water out and not just having run off into the centre of the town high street. So I think for me it's about working in conjunction with the government agencies like DEFRA, but also groups like the Environment Agency, and working with our local landowners, because ultimately we need to have things like not to have straight canals. We need to be having meandering rivers which have got trees planted, so it slows down the river flow. So there's a lot of work we need to do together. And from my personal perspective, I found it quite difficult sometimes working with these different lobby groups where the conservation environmentalists sit in this room, and then the farming and the landowners sit in this room, and trying to get them together to have a conversation, so you're all working together on tackling flooding is one of the things that I've been trying to do in my constituency.
Okay, great. Sticking with this side of the room, Ryan, do you have anything to add on international adaptation?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the international side, Theo mentioned in her opening remarks that international collaboration is key. And I think that, and I totally agree, I think there's a risk in the UK that we're always at a risk of talking ourselves down a bit and being gloomy. But the reality is we have so much soft power, and we have such ability to convene. We are part of the G7, we have a seat on the UN Security Council, world's 6th largest economy, founding member of NATO, led Europe, despite being outside the EU, after the invasion of Ukraine, supporting the Ukrainians. We're one of the largest shareholders of the World Bank. Half the world at least speaks our language. So I think we can play a really good convening role. There is a trade-off to that. We have to show leadership on climate change. I think that we are. I think most people in this room would want us to do more. That's maybe a separate topic of conversation. But I think we shouldn't overlook that convening power and our ability to get people in the room and drive forward positive discussion.
Fantastic. Zoe, are we building for the future yet?
No, we're not. UK homes are not fit for purpose. They're not ready for climate change. UK homes are incredibly leaky. Just looking at our European counterparts. So a standard way to measure the energy leakage in your home is if it's 20 degrees inside the house and 0 degrees outside of the house, how many degrees of heat do you lose in 1 hour? In Germany, it's 1 degree. In Italy, it's 1.5 degrees. Here, it's 3 degrees. Homes are incredibly leaky. As you can see in all these really handy-dandy SEN flyers, less than 5% of homes in England have an EPC rating of A, and 20% of homes overheat in the summer. It's also really important to keep in mind that the UK's housing stock is also very old. That's one of the reasons why it's so leaky. When you're talking about those traditionally built homes, those homes that were built before 1919, only 10% of those meet an EPC C rating or higher. It's very, very difficult to retrofit these homes, and it's very, very important that we do so. The leakiness of UK homes has a very clear and significant impact on the NHS. It costs annually £1.4 billion to treat people whose health is affected by poor housing. And when you take into account the broader societal costs of poor housing, that number gets up to £18.5 billion. That said, if we were to bring the approximately 13 million homes that are currently below an EPC C rating, that could unlock £40 billion of socioeconomic benefits. That's benefits to our NHS, that's benefits to local economies and prosperity. One of the problems is that it's really hard, number one, to retrofit our existing housing stock, especially if you're talking about those pre-1919 homes. If anybody here has a traditionally built home and you've tried to replace your single pane windows with triple glazing, you will know how incredibly difficult it is. Especially as local planning authorities are dealing with the COVID backlogs of all these applications to retrofit their homes. Increasingly, we're seeing reports of applications for pre-1919 home retrofits taking months longer than they should. They're not given an opportunity to have any pre-application meetings, and there's a lot of inconsistencies and mistakes that are happening from those extremely stretched local planning departments in terms of giving guidance on how you can retrofit those homes. One of the ways that we can really address those issues for our existing housing stock is if local authorities would be able to provide a suite of options for how you can retrofit your home. What are the different types of materials that it is recommended that you use, and these could effectively be as close to pre-approved as possible so that you can get through the process a lot faster. But that also doesn't encapsulate all the challenges with building new homes. Health really does begin at home. The home in which you live is the foundation for your health outcomes. I live in Southwark, where there's a road. If you live on the north side of that road, you will live on average 8 years longer than if you live on the south side of that road. It's really important that we loosen planning restrictions so that we can build more homes where people already live. And it's really important that we also educate and bring on side the various insurers to educate them on the sustainable materials that we can be using. For example, engineered wood, otherwise known as mass timber, is a really highly safe, highly tested, highly proven material. I see you shaking your head, but I promise you in Canada we're using it to build fire stations, we're using it to build hospitals, we're using it to build 18-story buildings, and you're able to build them extremely quickly, extremely safely, and they come at a very high level of air tightness. I would also just very quickly like to speak to respond to the question from the councillor from SLO. There are a lot of really, really great locally led solutions to mitigate health effects of climate change. Lambeth has done a really excellent job with their greening up strategy, and they've done so by identifying the wonder drug of green infrastructure. I know in health circles we don't like to talk about any sort of wonder drug, but that wonder drug is trees. Trees have a significant positive effect on our health, not only from providing a lot of mental health benefits, reducing depression, reducing anxiety. They also create shade. They improve our air quality. And there was a study in Toronto, in Canada, where they looked, the sample size was about 30,000 people, and they assessed the impact of having 10 extra trees on your city block. The health effects of 10 extra trees was equivalent to being 7 years younger or $10,000 richer. Trees are a really, really, really powerful and low-cost way of greening up our infrastructure, greening up our cities, and Lambeth has done a really fantastic job of pioneering that as a locally led solution.
Fantastic. And Archie, you want to come in on any of those questions at all?
Oh my goodness, there is any space. To echo Ryan's point around the UK really using it sort of soft diplomacy within these multilateral spaces as well. If there was, I think the councillor from Slough had asked for us the single most effective solution that you could do. I wish it existed, but it all has to be context specific. So it's genuinely about, from the health sector as well, how the two sectors are working together, and again, how we see them. A climate issue is a health crisis.
Okay. I think we're going to go for another round of questions. So should we go for this side of the room this time? So we've got 2 in the aisle and 1 right up front.
Thanks very much. My name is Henson. I work at Friends of the Earth. I'm very interesting session. Thanks so much. As an eco-fanatic, I fitted a heat pump and retrofitted my house, and so various other people I know, colleagues and so on. One of the things we didn't expect as a benefit for this is it's a much nicer climate inside the house. It stays a consistent temperature all day long. You don't have that thing where your boiler's on in the morning, it's hot, it's cold at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, etc. And I don't know anything about whether that has health benefits. If it did, I was wondering if there's any stats on that, because what the benefits of that? Because that right now the kind of messaging on retrofitting is, God, it's expensive, it's disruptive. Not that much, it took 48 hours, but whatever. But if we could tell people they'll live longer, that would be kind of a nice selling point. So is that true?
Next.
Thanks. Richard Clarke, Leader of Culture Council and co-president of UK 100. I want to inject a dose of depression and realism here. We're talking about mitigation and some very good stuff on the micro scale. But I don't think we're talking about the scale of the problem we need to tackle and the scale of mitigation we need. The last time there was this much CO2 in the atmosphere was 3 million years ago. Given a few hundred or thousand years of that, sea levels were 20 to 25 metres higher. How are we going to mitigate that? Being more something, I mean, okay, it's hundreds of years from now, we hope, but even so, being slightly more short-term, 50 years, the Environment Agency say the Thames Barrier will fail in a storm surge. 23% of London, 20% of Londoners live in areas that will flood if the Thames Barrier fails. How are we going to mitigate that? It's great talking about health now, but you mentioned migration. You think we've got the Northern Hemisphere has a migration problem now. Give it 10 years. We are talking about some really serious issues, really fundamentally challenging issues. So coming to a question, our politics works on short-term cycles, and it's very hard to plan long-term. How are we going to take those long-term steps to make the changes that will actually mean we don't have to mitigate on a scale that means London is no longer habitable and Amsterdam is underwater?
Okay, thank you for that dose of realism. Now we've got down here at the front.
Is a question regarding land management, because you were talking about forest fires in Canada, you were talking about desertification in Africa, or flooding in the UK using this solution that you mentioned. So what do you think about land management as a potential solution? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think given Ryan was directly called out there, we'll start with you. We've talked about climate migration. How do you mitigate the really big stuff?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, we need that dose of realism for sure. I mean, you mentioned migration. I think this is the argument I always make and have been making over the past 2 days at this conference. We spent £3 billion last year on dealing with the consequences of refugees and asylum seekers and so on and so forth. And that money came straight out of the aid budget. And the saddest thing of all is that money, as far as I'm concerned, is just wasted, because it's done absolutely nothing to solve the reason why people have come in the first place. It's just like paying for plasters, really. It's just a waste of time. So I think, first of all, we can put that right, spend that money where it can be most effective. I think once the economy is growing again, as soon as we can get back to spending 0.7% on overseas development, I think that would be a good start. I think we can always be more strategic on how we spend our development money. There's so many problems in the world, so many challenges. It's always going to be difficult to divvy it accordingly, but I think we should be more mindful of the fact that climate change is that threat multiplier that I spoke of at the beginning. And I think we have to your point around short-termism, I think we have to be much more long-term in our thinking. And the Prime Minister said last week, I think it was, that he wants us to take decisions for the long term. More of that. I think that's what's necessary. And I always speak to colleagues who work in places like China, and other areas, and they say, you know, the Chinese take decisions 20, 25 years in the future. They can obviously have very different political systems to us, but I think there's things we could do to think more long term. Because these issues for me aren't party political. They're really political. Deciding on how we spend this money is a really political decision, and politicians should be all over it. But it shouldn't really be party political. So I think if we can neutralise some of that and have a really good conversation about what we need, and then iron out the differences that we have between respective parties, and try and coalesce around a sort of programme for making change. And I think we can sell it to the public. I think it'd be really hard. I might be being naive and idealistic. Theo's obviously elected, so she'll put me right in a second. But I think that's the way forward. So that's how I'd start.
Do you want to go ahead and put him right there?
Well, Ryan and I have discussed this many times about how do we make these international arguments to constituents. I think it's fair to say that when I knock on doors in Stafford, these are not issues coming up on the doorstep. People are not asking about drought in Kenya. They want to know about getting a job, putting their kids in a good school, sorting out the high school generation. So one of the things I'm always trying to do as someone who is interested in international affairs is to say to my constituents, you think that what happens in, say, Kenya doesn't affect you here in Stafford, but actually that's not true. We do live in an interconnected world, and what happens globally does affect us locally. And firstly, just to pick up on your point about politics being too short-term, I absolutely agree. I think for me, I'm particularly interested in UK aid programming, and the fact that when we do programme grants through the Foreign Commonwealth Office, we tend to do grants for a very short period of time. We might be renewing them after, say, 12 months. And if you're going to work into a community in a sub-Saharan African country, it takes years to build up the level of trust to work with these donor countries, to work with the programmes and the NGOs on the ground. And I've been pushing the government to do this. We need to commit to multiple-year funding for these programmes so that we can start to see those results over a long period of time. And the things we're talking about are not one thing like building a school, and once you build the school, you can hand it over and it can be run by the local authority. These are projects where we might be working on, say, farming and irrigation, and that's going to be over multiple harvests and multiple cycles. So we've got to do that. And just to give you an example in my own constituency of where we are trying to do that long-term planning, I've just been on a visit with Forestry England to Cannock Chase, which is in my constituency. It's the UK's smallest area of outstanding natural beauty. Recommend you go there. It's like Canada. We've got beautiful high trees. It's like being a national park. But what really was striking is what they said to me is we were. You may not be aware of the background of Forestry England, but it was set up in the wake of the World Wars to make sure that we could basically grow enough trees to have timber in the UK. So as an island, we had that security. But I was really struck by the trees they're planting now. They are planting trees which basically don't grow currently in the United Kingdom. They grow in the south of France. And that's because they're planning 50 years ahead of what trees are being planted in my local forest in my ANOB. And that was a really striking sober statistic, that they expect climate change to have so affected us in the Midlands that the temperature in Stafford will be what it currently is in Saint-Tropez, and that is the trees they're currently planting right now in the West Midlands for 50 years' time.
Wow. And actually, we talked a bit about co-benefits of actually acting on climate change and adapting for the future, such as getting heat pumps. And also educating people on this. How do we get around that? How do we communicate these benefits?
Well, this is exactly what we want to fund. This is what we want to fund. This is the type of investment that we want to be putting Wellcome's research funding into, because it's exactly that. And our friends of the Earth colleague that's in the audience. When we're looking at these adaptation strategies, for example, appraising them for the health impacts and the benefits is exactly what we want to start doing and building that into the narrative. Because, like you said, people will listen if it's going to give them 20 extra years, or if it alleviates a symptom or morbidity.
Fantastic. And Zoe, do you want to pick up on any of these potential land management one, given you talk about the wildfires in Canada?
Yeah, so I think that one of the great ways that you can protect your existing properties is by trying to integrate some form of low carbon or renewable energy into those projects. It's a way that you can also increase the value of those assets. I wouldn't be able to tell you just how, what kind of effect heat pumps have on your health, but because I know that Henry had asked about that earlier, but having low carbon energy infrastructure built into those homes, and then ideally being able to sell some of that electricity back to the grid is another very effective way that we can start to demonstrate the benefits of the transition to net zero, the decarbonization transition to local communities in a way that they can really feel acutely and immediately. I would also say that when we're also talking about how can we manage our existing property portfolios, that's an area where having a national retrofit strategy would be incredibly helpful and incredibly useful. Not only to share best practices from within the industry, but also to identify green financing opportunities. For example, through the Green Finance Institute, they have some really excellent loan programs. That would also be very important for identifying and sort of scaling up training and upskilling for people already in the construction sector, the property management sector. Having that kind of national retrofit strategy is something where the government can really demonstrate a lot of leadership on. From my many conversations with industry, they're ready. They want this. They just need a target to aim for. And that's where that kind of national leadership from the government can really go very far.
Okay, great. How many questions do we have left? Let's see the scale of... Okay, we've got a few. I think I'm going to take only 2 now because we're getting really close, so I must beg you, please keep it short and to the point. Down here.
Thank you. This has been a great panel. Thanks so much. Katie Ramsey from the National Trust. So the National Trust has recognised that climate change is the biggest threat to places that we care for. And we've tried really hard to kind of centralise and operationalise our approach to climate adaptation in our business. But I look around at the nation and I don't see the same thing happening. I think it's fascinating that there is one event at this whole conference about climate adaptation. So we commissioned some research for Public First that asked, how do we...
Short and to the point, please.
I'm getting there, I promise. It's literally, this is a question that I would like to put to the panel, which is, how do we rescue climate adaptation from being climate mitigation's poor relation? What can we do in government to centralise it and make it more of an issue?
Okay, fantastic. And just over there.
Thank you. Excellent panel. I'm Layla Busbar from the Coalition for Global Prosperity. Indigenous women, black women, women from low-income countries, they're a heavier burden from the impacts of climate change. And we'll discuss this a little bit when we talk about climate health and the people overseas. So thank you to Theo and Ryan. My question is, how can we ensure that these women's voices are at the forefront of discussions like this, but especially COP28 that we know is coming up? Thank you.
Okay, Ryan, I think it's cheating, but you've got someone from your organisation to ask a question, so you're going last. Can we start over here? Is adaptation, is adaptation mitigation's poorer cousin? Should it be? Should we be focusing more on adaptation? And what do we think about the impacts of women specifically? Who wants to come in?
I could take the first question, just on adaptation being a poorer relation. The two do just have to be seen together in terms of mitigation strategies and adaptation. We cannot keep seeing them independently. If we don't mitigate enough, there is only so much limit to our adaptation as well that we could do. As our council colleague gave us a dose of reality earlier, we can't really adapt if we're underwater. So I would say the two just generally have to be seen hand in hand. It's seen hand in hand in the Paris Agreement as well. So if we're going to live up to our commitments, the two do need to be seen together. And that does mean giving a portion of climate financing to adaptation measures, because it, in that respect, you absolutely do see it as not receiving enough financing.
Okay, and Zoe?
In Canada, a lot of our Indigenous communities are being forced out of their homes because of melting ice caps, because of fires, because of smoke from fires. And especially because these are the communities who are most regularly affected by these extreme weather events. We're seeing very long-term health consequences and a lot of knock-off health effects. that's an area where, you know, in Canada we are working very closely with Indigenous communities, as well as BME communities as well, to really identify what are those health effects from climate change that these communities are particularly vulnerable to, and what are the ways within these communities that we can try to engage with public health officials. For example, you know, how do we engage with traditional Indigenous healers while also leveraging some of the resources that local public health authorities have? It's also, you know, very important to remember that a lot of these communities are at a much higher risk of the health effects of climate change. You know, the street that I had mentioned in Southwark, where on the north side, chances are you're going to live about 8 years longer. The north side is predominantly white, and the south side is predominantly BAME. So, you know, there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to how do you really appropriately engage with these communities in a way that is, you know, really creating space at the decision-making table to identify those strategies that work. But I think that, you know, operating at the local most level is one of the best ways that you can actually create that space at the decision-making table, so that these communities can voice their, you know, unique experiences, and so that we can identify strategies that actually work for them.
Okay, brilliant. Do you want to come back to something?
One thing, which is just the vast amount of knowledge that also exists within these communities. You know, we're sometimes not reinventing the wheel. Indigenous knowledge is incredibly important and recognised within the UNFCCC processes. So as we head into COP, there will be pavilions, there will be opportunities to help bring policymakers together with Indigenous communities and, importantly, women and the youth as well.
I'll also quickly add that a lot of the sort of low carbon solutions, a lot of the ways that we can adapt our homes are very expensive. These are very expensive. You know, installing a heat pump, even if you do manage to qualify for the £5,000 subsidy by placing the heat pump 1 meter away from the boundary, 7 meters away from the, you know, nearest home, it's still going to cost you several £1,000s. So if we can find ways to you know, offer a partial rebate for energy efficient retrofits and installations, then that's one other way that we can democratize low carbon solutions and the kind of energy efficient retrofits that we really need.
Fantastic. Theo, is adaptation poor customer mitigation?
So I agree they're both important, and I think the government does actually recognise that if you look at where we're spending our investment funding. Just to pick up on two things. First, we just mentioned about the cost of the taxpayer. You've all obviously seen the Prime Minister's recent announcements in the last week. Just to remind you all that one of the announcements he made was that we were going to increase the boiler upgrade scheme cash grants by 50% to $7,500. So that really is going to support consumers who do want to make that transition to heat pumps. And that's something I do support, because I do think it is a huge burden financially on some of my constituents who don't earn a lot of money, and actually I'm pleased that the government's stepping in to help. I just want to make a sort of final point about where the UK government is trying to focus on renewable energy, and for me I think that's a pretty major shift in the last few years of government policy. I was trade envoy under previous governments, I was reappointed recently by the Prime Minister, and we have made a significant effort in our policies to move away from investing in fossil fuels, and I was given a specific instruction to go and find renewable projects for the British government to sign projects with. So when I was in Kenya last week, I've just signed an agreement on behalf of the UK government for the Grand High Falls Dam, and that project is going to be $2.3 billion of British company investments going into Kenya, and that's specifically looking at green energy. And our Prime Minister met with President Ruto at COP last year in Egypt, and they agreed 6 key high projects which the governments would work together on, and every single one of those 6 projects is a green project. So it really shows you from the very highest level of government, those are the projects that I'm delivering ahead of the African Investment Summit, and that's from the Prime Minister down that he is telling us to invest in renewables, and that's what I'm doing as Australian boy.
Fantastic. And finally, Ryan.
Well, I think as a white male from Hertfordshire, I'm probably not best placed to offer anything groundbreaking on how we get more women from the global south involved in COP and so on. But I do think we can get behind some of the Bridgetown agenda. I think the Foreign Secretary's comments in the summer about getting India a seat on the Security Council and other nations, I think is really sensible. So we can start there, and I think stuff that we already know about making sure women's voices are embedded in all levels of decision making is really important.
Okay, thank you. And I think we are now completely out of time, so thank you all for coming. I would like to plug, because we've had so much talk about energy efficiency today, that actually on the Sen stand, today's campaign is on energy efficiency. So you go by the stand or over to that table there, you can pick up notebooks, you can pick up stickers, you can pick up tote bags, and you can take your picture with some of our lovely signs. Thank you all for coming. Thank you especially to Wellcome Trust for sponsoring. Thank you all to the rest of my panellists as well. The next event will be here in half an hour, and it will be License to Drill. So do stick around for that.